Hello, y'all. Welcome to the 5th episode of 10 Years in Bed, a mental health podcast for the mentally ill, by the mentally ill. I am your host, Allison. Some of you guys might know me on Instagram as Tism Pump, and today I'm going to be talking about how I'm kind of like Rue from Euphoria, if I'm being so fucking for real. And I'm going to be touching on obsessive compulsive disorder today. So, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the show Euphoria, but I got about a minute into the show before I felt my heart sink. And one of the first things that you see on the show is you see the main character, her name is Rue, and it shows her being a kid at the dinner table, and she's looking up at the ceiling and she's counting the ceiling tiles, and one of her parents interrupts her and she starts crying. And she's young, I think like 8 or 9, and she goes to a doctor and she gets diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, with borderline personality disorder, or potentially BPD, definitely bipolar, generalized anxiety disorder, and depression. And I was like, girly pop, that is me to a T. And one thing that I don't talk about very often is when I was really young, I think like 8 or 9, I got diagnosed as having obsessive compulsive disorder. And it was so fucking debilitating. And it all started in church, actually. When I saw the pastor do in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, and he put his hands out like this. And if you're watching or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, after you kind of put your hands in a prayer position, you hold them out. And that's kind of where my OCD began. And every time that I'd pray, I'd put my hands out like that. And it started manifesting in very different ways. So in the beginning, and this is, I've always had an obsession with the number 3 or with multiples of 3. And that's something that has still carried into my adult life, but it's less aggressive now than it used to be. And it all started with me whenever I was praying, I would do that 3 times and then hold my arms out. And this is kind of hard to talk about because I actually didn't realize kind of how bad it was until I had brought it up with my mom the other day and we were talking about OCD. So what's interesting is you'll hear a lot of people say that they're OCD when they're talking about being obsessive in the way that they clean. And OCD is not just about cleanliness. It's a very common misconception that people have about OCD. So OCD does have to do with 3 things: obsessions, compulsions, and general patterns. When it comes to obsessions, I'm just reading this, it has to do with intrusive, unwanted, or distressing thoughts, images, or urges that can exist in the realm of, I guess, fear of contamination, harm or causing harm to others. It can be unpleasant sexual or religious obsessions. Ding, 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 we have a winner. Or the need for symmetry, order, or exactness. How it comes up with compulsions, it can be repetitive behaviors or mental acts performed to reduce anxiety, to prevent a feared event, which is something I'll get into next. Checking things repeatedly, such as locks or appliances, and counting or repeating words silently. And lastly, when it comes to general patterns, it can be significant time spent on rituals, and that impacts daily functioning, distress and impairment caused by obsessions and compulsions, and recognition that the obsessions are not based in reality, but difficulty controlling the compulsive behaviors. So for me, it started with the Holy Trinity. And then when I was talking to my mom about it, something that I had no idea that I did or any recollection of me doing was I would go up the stairs in multiples of 3, and if I missed a step, I would have to start over. And she also talked about how when I was drinking things, I would, if I was drinking from a glass, I couldn't just set it down. I'd have to tap it 3 times. For me, the biggest memory, I guess, of having OCD as a child that really impacted every single part of my life was floors. Floor tiles, Um, sorry, just thinking about it really upsets me. Because the thing is unless you're sitting on something, your feet are on the floor, or you're lying down, your feet are on the floor. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the saying, step on a cracker, break your mother's back. I took that very, very literally. So when it comes to flooring or tiles, in my mind, if I didn't tap a certain number of tiles or floorboards in a specific order in a set amount of time, I genuinely thought that my mother was going to die. So I was constantly living in this state of dysregulation where I was obsessed with my mom dying. And that is only something that I kind of got over in the past few years, obsession with her dying, and trying to figure out how to prevent it, because you can't. But I was like, I couldn't do anything or going anywhere or step anywhere without thinking like that. And I remember being in grocery stores, like with my mom, like waiting in line at checkout and just having to tap the tiles in the grocery store. And I knew that it was psychotic, like not psychotic. I feel like that has a really negative connotation, but I knew that it wasn't based in reality. Yet I genuinely felt like if I didn't do it, she was actually going to die. And much love to her. She's probably listening to this right now. But when I was talking to her about OCD the other day, she was just laughing about it. And it caused me such deep emotional distress, because I was constantly worried that if I didn't do these things, that she was actually going to die. Sorry. And it's really fucking debilitating. And that really kind of started to present itself when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I remember very vividly my mom taking me to see like a therapist or a psychiatrist who told me to draw a happy house. And I was self-aware enough as a child to know what they were looking for when drawing a happy house. So I knew what to draw to come off seemingly normal, which is fucking hilarious now that I think about it in retrospect. But there were other things, I guess, that continued on throughout childhood into adulthood that I am kind of realizing in this moment, where the compulsions to a degree would stop, but I still had very compulsive and repetitive behaviors that I felt really would influence, I guess, the outcome of my life, whether it was like small things or big things. And one of the ways that it really came out was at hockey games. And I used to, growing up, I played boys hockey from, I think, grade 5 until grade 10 or grade 11 when I started doing drugs. And I had this fortune cookie on my helmet, and I would do this thing to give myself, like, quote unquote, quick luck, where I'd tap my fortune cookie and then tap my chest and do that 3 times in order to give myself quick luck. I don't know. That was just kind of like how I conceptualized it. I have no idea. And then in order to give my teammates quick luck, I would rub my forehead and then rub their helmet. In order to give myself long luck, that's how I thought about it. I don't know, like in my head, I would tap my helmet, tap the top of my stick, and then I'd move up my stick 3 times, flip it over, wipe the blade, shoot it at the opponent's goalie, shoot it at my goalie, and then touch my chest. So, like, if you ever came to one of my hockey games, you'd think I was fucking psychotic, because I was constantly touching my chest, touching my helmet, and that's what I did when I was on the bench. And I genuinely thought that influenced the outcome of the game. Which is, like, I understand that, you know, there are, like, rituals when it comes to sports, but that was kind of, like, a whole other level. Anyway, back to a little bit about how my life was kind of like Rue from Euphoria. So, growing up, she had a lot of mental health issues. She dealt with OCD, and you could tell that when her patterns were disrupted, she got really dysregulated, and I was the same. And her first time in rehab, along with mine, was at 17 years old. And I realized after I had an overdose and slipped into drug-induced psychosis that I needed help. And every single time that I went to rehab, I always was the one to put myself in it. No one ever made me go. And after going to rehab for the first time, when I got kicked out for the first time, I got kicked out the first 3 times, but I digress. When I got kicked out, my boyfriend, partner at the time, had a party for me, and then obviously I relapsed the second I got out. Big fucking surprise. I didn't realize at the time, after the first time being in rehab, that I would be able to... I thought that I would just be able to stop doing hard drugs, and then that would, I guess, fix my problems. So I didn't do hard drugs for the first 3 days. And then after day 3, my partner at the time, who had never done hard drugs, was introduced to hard drugs while I was in rehab by my quote-unquote best friend, who I asked to keep an eye on him while I was in rehab. And her version of keeping an eye on him meant introducing him to our older group of friends who all did hard drugs. So, yeah, shout out to you, Michaela, Miss Girl. Anyway, so I went to rehab and I moved through life, and slowly the OCD tendencies started to dissipate, and they didn't have as much of a hold on my life as they did when I was really, really young. That being said, I mean, I have a plethora of other mental health issues and autism to fall back on. So if I wasn't dysregulated from OCD, I was dysregulated in, various other ways, which is so fucking fun for me. So other, I guess, parallels that I wanted to bring up that I thought was very interesting. It's funny when you are so good at being a drug addict, like I was. There was a scene in Euphoria that Rue goes to her drug dealer's house and she tries to get drugs from him, and he refuses to sell to her. And that actually happened to me, interestingly enough. One morning when I tried to pick up at 7 a.m. and my dealer at the time told me that he would no longer deal to me, which in retrospect I appreciated. There's actually an interesting backstory. This is so fucking ADHD. I don't know if I've mentioned it on here before. I might have mentioned it in previous YouTube videos. But anyway, it's interesting because his parents are lawyers and my mom is a lawyer, and they're in the same friend group. So years later down the line, and they knew that their son was a drug dealer, I had talked to them and told them that I appreciated his kind of like act of kindness. I didn't at the time, but that he actually refused to sell to me anymore because he was like, you're too fucked up. Like, I cannot contribute to you killing yourself anymore, which I thought was kind of funny. And it's interesting at such a young age, getting fully sober and then trying to navigate things as a fully sober individual while everybody else is just starting to party for the first time. And I remember when I fully got sober, a year after I got sober, I started hanging out with an old hockey teammate of mine and all of his friends. And I went through this period for like 3 months, a year into sobriety, where I would hang out with them every night for like months on end. And I would just smoke cigarettes, and they'd be up doing drugs all night until like 5, 6, 7 in the morning. And I'd stay with them all night, not doing drugs. It was the most insane thing. I don't know what possessed me to do this to myself in early sobriety. I think the thing is like when you become sober at such a young age, because I already went through the partying phase that everybody goes through when they become an adult, when they start paying for school, when they're going to college. So I felt like I was kind of like missing out on that, and I wanted to, I don't know, I guess still exist in that world and still be able to have fun and like have all these experiences that everybody else was starting to have. But it just really wasn't serving me. And I remember one night specifically where I kind of had enough, and I stood up and I was like, no, I don't want to be here anymore. And one of the guys I was hanging out with was like, got really, really frustrated with me and was like, what the fuck? Like, I don't know. I don't remember verbatim what was said, but I just remember him feeling really insulted. And I was like, listen, like, this is just me putting a boundary down. I just can't do this anymore. Like, I don't know what made me think that I could exist in this, I don't know, in these surroundings, surrounded by people who were doing all these fucking drugs all night in front of me. But like, I just kind of had enough, and I got up and I skateboarded home. I left and I was like, all right, we're kind of done with this shit. I'm over it. As time goes on, as I said before, I mean, the OCD has really dropped down in severity, but I find it creeping back in certain instances. Like, there are things that I still do till this day that are kind of like OCD tendencies, but I wouldn't classify or re-diagnose or self-diagnose myself as someone who has OCD. I find in moments where I have high levels of stress or anxiety, or I'm very dysregulated, or there's something in the near future that I'm kind of approaching that I'm very anxious about, that's when I find the OCD coming out again. Again, there are things that I do, little things like whenever I lock my car, I have to lock it 3 times. I don't know why. It's just kind of a thing that's kind of carried over into my life, but it doesn't control me in the way that things did when I was a kid. And I find things coming out now when I'm very stressed. Like, for example, I have moments where, you know, when I was about to go through a breakup or when I was interviewing for a big job, and I would find myself seeing something on the ground and saying to myself, I need to step on that. If I don't step on that, then I'm not going to get the job. So I would like find myself trying to disrupt these patterns of thought where I knew what was going on. I knew I was being obsessive and I had to find a way to disrupt that. And I'd say, okay, I need to step anywhere but here in this exact spot. I need to step anywhere other than that spot so that I could interrupt those patterns of behavior to be like, okay, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going back into that. It's super destructive for you. So you need to step anywhere but this. So you need to step anywhere but here. I don't really like to speak on things that it's funny because, you know, as time progresses, sometimes I'll go through moments where I experience less mental illness or moments where I feel like I'm doing really well and I'm no longer mentally ill. And it's amazing. And then I forget that, you know, mental illness is a long-term, lifetime diagnosis, and it's not something that you can just stop experiencing. You know, there are moments where, you know, it could be days, weeks, or months where you're doing really well, but at the end of the day, your brain is just wired differently. And as time progresses, you know, you're able to disrupt those patterns of thought a little easier, maybe, and you're able to build better coping mechanisms, but it's always still going to be there. And that's really stressful to think about. Because you have these moments where you're just like, you're feeling so fucking good, and you're like, oh my God, amazing. Like, this is it. I'm cured. I'm not mentally ill anymore. And it's funny because I've had moments like that in my life where I've, you know, been for years trying to do mental health advocacy. And I think I can't even speak about this anymore. Like, it's just not appropriate because I no longer have these issues, which is just kind of fucking hilarious. But what a nice time for me to have a couple weeks of a break in life. I haven't felt that way in a really long time though, unfortunately. Oh, yeah. It's interesting going through sobriety at such a young age, because it's something that a lot of people don't understand, and I felt like very connected with Rue from Euphoria for that reason. I just felt like I was watching a story of myself unfold, and honestly, it was really upsetting and dysregulating to see. That being said, like, I'm very lucky for having the self-awareness to realize that I needed help at such a young age. I also got sober before I ever started paying for school. Big slay. The number of people that I know that decided to take out student loans and then use them to get drunk. Unreal. But I think my biggest message for this episode specifically is a lot of people have the tendency who like things really clean to say that it's just like it's them being OCD. And while I do always think that self-diagnosis is valid, you just need to be very careful about the weight of your words, because OCD is... Sorry, I'm getting very emotional. OCD is extremely fucking debilitating. And the thing that's very frustrating about it is the inability to disrupt those patterns of behavior that you know, like if you're doing it for whatever reason. In my instance, I was doing it because I genuinely thought that my mom was going to die. Like, you know that those thoughts aren't actually based in reality, yet you firmly believe that if you don't perform those series of tasks in a specific order in a specific amount of time, then something really, really bad is going to happen. So, as always, just be very careful, because your words hold a lot of weight. And while cleaning obsessively, can present its own set of issues, just be careful about throwing that term around and don't use it lightly, because it's something that people suffer from and it rules their life on not just a daily basis, but minute by minute, second by second, and it is so fucking debilitating. And I honestly am so fucking happy and so fucking lucky that it's not something that I struggle with anymore, because as a kid it just completely ruined my fucking life. So, as always, just be careful, because your words hold a lot of weight, and you have the potential to invalidate somebody else's struggles. So be careful, I guess. As always, if you made it to the end of this episode, thank you so much for listening. I hope that something in this episode was a little bit of value to you. If you liked it, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you could follow me, leave a 5-star rating if you liked the episode, comment, let me know if you liked it, what you liked about it. If you didn't like it, let me know what you didn't like about it as well, because we are obviously in very early stages with this podcast. So any constructive criticism or feedback, I would absolutely love to hear it. If you are watching on YouTube, if you could smash that like button, hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. Comment below. If you'd like to talk to me about anything mental health or addiction related, autism related, just send me a DM. Usually I'm very good with responding to those.